was a sow's ear out of which nothing fine could be made. I was his complete superior, and I had been sadly cheated in having him for a teacher.
2022.
It was a cold winter that year, and Lestat was my coal fire, and I found myself for the very first time, to anyone other than Paul, confiding my struggles to another man.
San Francisco.
He appeared frail and stupid to me, a man made of dried twigs with a thin, carping voice.
Dubai.
I had never allowed myself to feel emotionally close to anyone, much less a man. Lestat had surrounded me. The version we speak of now is the more nuanced portrait.
Or the more rehearsed.
Perhaps I was mistaken about the Wolverine blues.
Fuck the Wolverine blues. Ken Burns can choke in the footnotes. It's the abused-abuser psychological relationship I'm talking about.
I do not consider myself abused.
I mean, usually when you're a little too close to it, the abused still loves the abuser. But you flipped it completely on its head.
I'm not a victim.
50 years later, you talk like he was your soulmate. Like you were locked in some fucked up gothic romance. Why?
I am in my Buick, staring in the rearview mirror at my daughter in the car seat, an hour after I gave Derek, a guy I don't know, the last $30 I had. My editor reminds me it's 7 years before car seats are mandatory. My ex-wife reminds me I never owned a Buick. This is the Odyssey of Recollection. The tapes are an admitted performance. This is the premise of our interview. Half a century later, allow me my Odyssey.
Watching Interview with the Vampire has been an experience for me, to say the least, right? There have been a lot of things that were changed between the book, also between the original film that came out, starring Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Antonio Banderas, Kirsten Dunst, and some others. And one thing that I'll say is that within this rendition of Interview with the Vampire, treating the 1990s interview as if it was something that happened 50 years ago, and this being a rehashing of that interview in a more updated and current format, I love this. And one thing that really came to mind in this concept of the Odyssey of Recollection is that this is an answer, or in my own view, it is a response, and it exposes different aspects of cancel culture and the Me Too movement, right? And there's a lot of different reasons why I say this, right? See, originally, when Anne Rice wrote the character of Lestat in her original books, right, in the Vampire Chronicles, Lestat was meant to be a representation of her ex-husband, right? But as she continued with the series of Vampire Chronicles, Lestat ended up being more of an expression of her animus, right? Like, if you understand Jungian psychology, became more of a representation of her animus, and then later on, Lestat became the primary protagonist of the Vampire Chronicles series. Now, something that's powerful within this, to me, is just some basic understanding when it comes to human interactions and psychology, and some of the issues that rise about when it comes to the Me Too movement and cancel culture. Now, there are definitely some people who are dirtbags. There are definitely some people who need to receive accountability for their actions, for being those who are predatory and take advantage of the weak, who at times may use their positions of power and leverage that against someone's livelihood in order to have sexual access to them. People who may do a whole gambit of things that are unethical in order to have access to an individual who they are interested in. But something else to understand is that while watching this, and this is one reason why I appreciate the showrunners really being out there and upfront with the sexual nature of the attraction and the desire between Lestat and Louis, right? Because when you really think about it, Louis somewhat represents the masculine submissive, or to a certain extent, the brat. That's basically what Louis is. Louis was an individual who had to uphold this strong image all the time for the sake of appearances, but really was a closeted homosexual for a while, right? And he couldn't come to grasps with who he really was and what he really wanted. This sexual repression was something that was heavily inside of him, and a lot of it stemmed from different aspects of insecurity, but also the fear of judgment and shame from his peers, especially being a man living in the 1920s, right? And this is a very important point to bring up. See, when someone is in the masculine submissive, typically what they're going to attract to themselves is the feminine dominant, right? The feminine dominant is an individual who is attracted to a challenge. They aren't necessarily someone who is looking for someone who can immediately have that initial conversation and consent to what it is that they desire to do. They're excited by the hunt. They're excited by the thrill of the chase. And the issue with this hunt and this thrill of the chase is that at times there is a predatory aspect to this type of seduction, like what Lestat did when he met Louis, but also there is a big capacity for an individual to still retain and hold to the image that they have of themselves before they engage in those behaviors. Now, what the feminine dominant does is they give the masculine submissive the opportunity to tap into subspace, right? On the first episode of Interview with the Vampire, where Lestat invites, I believe her name was Lily, it was the woman that Louis would go and talk to, and she wouldn't question him about the fact that he wouldn't try to have sex with her because she was a prostitute. And during that time, they would interact with one another. But Lestat went and bought the time of Lily. Now, they may have engaged in some way because she did jump to giving him some head. But one thing that we'll also notice is that Lestat used a certain level of plausible deniability to get Louis into a scenario where he was highly aroused, and then his desire took over in that moment. Now, one thing to understand is that at times sexual arousal can lower a person's inhibitions below where their conscious mind would allow them to go, in the same way the drugs or alcohol can. But in that particular sequence, Lestat took part of the little drink, right? And he sent Louis to subspace with this bite that he had, right? Now, because in the Vampire Chronicles, there is a euphoria that comes with being fed on, right? It's a very transcendental experience that far supersedes and exceeds what a person experiences during sexual pleasure. So typically, the fangs entering into an individual is a phallic symbol that represents a penis, and the person being bitten is being in a submissive position of being dominated by that bite that's draining energy out of them. Now, if someone already has a low cup, there's only but so much that can come out of them before they experience something called subdrop. And what Louis experienced the next day when he woke up and he's coming out of this fog of ecstasy that he was in, he immediately did not want to see Lestat anymore. He still couldn't accept his nature as a homosexual, and he still couldn't accept the feelings that he had. So he just wanted to completely separate himself from having any type of dealings with and any type of connections with Lestat. Louis, to a certain extent, is the quintessential brat, right? Because he was the masculine submissive. He saw his morals, his values, his principles that, although were highly hypocritical and were not consistent, he saw those as what gave him value and what kept him on the right path, even if he felt like his path was contrary to the path that he wanted to lead. Got to understand this. See, one thing that does occur and we have to be very conscious of this, is that sometimes people end up in relationships that are toxic. Oftentimes people end up in relationships that are very passionate, right? That don't always cling to the rules and the social norms that people expect things to take place in, right? And when a person feels that they've been hurt in some capacity, even if their own decisions have encouraged them and led to a place where they would experience that type of hurt, it's often very difficult for an individual to be able to think about and to recollect those memories from a place that is truly honest and with the full view of not only how they see things, but how the other person sees things and what really happened. Like I always heard people say that there's 3 sides to the truth. Your point of view, the other person's point of view, and what really happened. So when I'm observing these interactions, one thing that I like that they did, and it kind of goes in line with the mentality that Anne Rice had about Lestat, which was that as he became the protagonist, I believe she wrote The Vampire Lestat, I think that's the name of the book. And when she wrote that, she started going over certain aspects of his character, certain things that he would do, certain ways that he would interact, and certain code that he had, being a vampire who held humans in a higher esteem than most. Right? But because the initial interview with the vampire was mostly about Louis venting his frustrations, his bitterness, and his resentment towards Lestat, that is the paint and the image and the glasses that experience, that relationship was seen through. Right? Now, one thing that I'll say is this. Oftentimes when a person experiences a traumatic experience, it's very difficult for that individual to be able to take any level of personal accountability for putting themselves in that scenario or making decisions that led to a place where things transpired that caused them to feel hurt. Right? Because if you jump straight to the personal accountability without first healing, then oftentimes it'll turn into blaming yourself for what other people did to you. And it will cause you to lessen the feeling of self-worth and self-value that you have. This is something that occurs for people unless you are a very highly accountable and logical person. But even being a logical person, you still have to experience the feelings that you have. You have to process those emotions, and you have to walk through those moving parts to understand how things got to where they were, because at the end of the day, a lot of things go left. And one thing that occurs oftentimes within this social justice warrior, cancel culture, Me Too, Twitter mob mentality era that we live in is that people remove all personal accountability from themselves in any scenario where they feel that they've experienced pain or trauma. Right? This is something that a lot of people do. But the issue is that now individuals can do this in a way to where instead of taking their time to heal and understand the situation, they have the capability of owning victimhood, right? Of owning victimhood, of viewing themselves as a victim, and by doing that, alleviating themselves of all a personal accountability and responsibility for their actions, for the scenarios that they put themselves in, for the things that they agree to, for the things they take part in, even things they consent to, and view the other person as a villain, as an evil individual, and to hold all types of anger and resentment and contempt for an individual. And now, not only can a person claim victimhood for the experiences that they've had, but they can also accrue a mob that will attack the person, regardless of how clear their recollection is of the scenario that they found themselves in, or how much plausible deniability that they afforded the other person and had afforded to themselves. Right? Like when we're looking at things a particular way, something to understand is that typically when a person may be in the masculine submissive, they may have a very negative view towards the things that they want and the things that they desire. And they're only going to really be able to experience the things that they truly want and truly desire in a moment of high passion, in a moment of very high levels of frustration. We see this in episode 3 with Louis, where he is refusing the opportunities to feast, where he is refusing the opportunities to feed on humans, and he's just feeding on animals, and he's starting to become weaker and weaker and weaker, and to the point where he feels like someone crossed him, so he's doing it out of anger, right? You see this moment where Louis says that he wants monogamy, but he doesn't truly want monogamy, right? Because he's not feeding, he's losing not only his strength, but his libido. And in losing his libido, he is still getting jealous towards Lestat for his actions, for what he likes to do, just out of jealousy, just out of possessiveness. And not from a place of, I'd meet your needs, so why are you going elsewhere? Now, Lestat said it was about variety. But at the same time, Lestat said, fuck whoever you want. As long as you come home to me, everything's good. But when Louis decided that he wanted to step out of the confines of his relationship dynamic, he did it with someone who he had history and feelings towards. He gave desire that he repressed towards his partner to another individual. So to a certain extent, that was much more of a factor of betrayal than what Lestat was currently doing. But I also think that it's interesting what they're doing is that they're treating this version of Louis and this version of Lestat as a more matured Louis who has alleviated himself from the victim mentality that he had 50 years ago during the initial interview. He's matured. He's come to accept himself more. He's healed from a lot of the traumas that he's experienced. And through the Odyssey of Recollection, he's looking back at the experiences that he had with Louis and realizing that, looking back at the experience that he had with Lestat and realizing that Lestat was someone who loved him. Lestat was someone who he cared for as well. And that Lestat wasn't nearly as much of a monster as he wanted to portray him due to his hurt and his resentment in the initial conversation. And this is just, this interview would only really affect Lestat but so much. But since it was published, it almost worked as a smear campaign that would go against the character and the integrity of who Lestat was as a vampire. And this is where the vampire Lestat came from. And he wanted to clear things up on his own, right? Because he was being slandered. He was being defamed by the narrative that was filtered through these eyes and these glasses, these shades of resentment and bitterness that Louis had towards Lestat, right? There is a point in time in episode 3 where Louis said, "You took my life." But Lestat gave Louis the opportunity to consent. Lestat showed Louis what he would do to him to turn him into what he turned him into. And he seduced him. He courted him. And after this situation transpired, years later, Louis could not accept the responsibility for his own actions and decisions. And he could not accept himself for who he was. For years, he couldn't accept his homosexual nature, his orientation. He couldn't accept that he was a vampire, right? He had a difficult time accepting a lot of things about himself, and these insecurities that he had, he would project this way he felt about himself onto others. And something to understand is that when you have this perspective of being unable to accept yourself, like let's say someone is religiously sexually repressed, there's a reason why a lot of the highest rates of sexually transmitted infections and a lot of the highest rates of teenage pregnancies and things of the like occur disproportionately high in the Bible Belt. Because when you view certain actions as wrong, but they're in your shadow, and you're looking for an opportunity to take part in that shadow, but you can't do it consciously because how strongly it goes against your morals, and you're unable to integrate with those desires, then oftentimes you're going to have to find a platform of a high enough level of passion or intensity, a high emotional scenario, or a high enough level of plausible deniability in order to engage in things that you truly desire to engage in. Right? To engage in things that you truly desire to engage in. And oftentimes a person who feels that way will view a person who doesn't respect their boundaries as the individual who desires them enough for them to tap into that space. Something real to understand, right? Something real to understand. Someone who doesn't respect those boundaries. That's why a lot of people say that toxic individuals have the best sex, right? That toxic sex is the best sex. Toxic sex is the best sex, right? That's why so many people say that, because when you're in a masculine submissive mentality and state of mind, an individual who desires you enough to disrespect your boundaries, to manipulate you, to coerce you a little bit, to find a way to find the loopholes and to skirt around your boundaries and your stances that aren't really all that strong, to get you in a position to where you're willing to wilt to their desires and tap into that submissive ego, right? To tap into that feminine submissive for a short period of time is what it is that you're attracted to and desire the most, because you don't accept yourself enough to be able to tap into that unless somebody is pushing you to do it. Right? It's just something to understand. And what this Odyssey of Recollection really does is it shows what happens years later. If you've had time to sit with yourself, like I'm sure there's plenty of women and maybe some men who have been in scenarios where they accuse someone of something, right? Or they felt that they were so gravely wronged, right? They were just so wrong. They were so downtrodden and mistreated in certain scenarios that if they look back at the scenario, there was a way that they carried themselves that led to the things that transpired. Right? Now, there are some scenarios where people need to get the full weight of the law thrown at them. There are some scenarios where retribution probably needs to take place. There are some scenarios where individuals are very deeply disturbed and fucked up, right? That's just the truth, right? But that's not every scenario. It's kind of like how you see every single woman say, for the most part, that her ex was a narcissist, right? And if we're looking at the percentages of how many men are narcissists in the world, isn't it like 2 to no more than 6% of people are staunch clinical level narcissists, right? So that means that either there are a lot more narcissists than it appears that there are. No. It means that either the way that that person carried themselves pulls and draws narcissism out of an individual, which is not something that is impossible, right? And these are things that can transpire. When you're operating in a masculine submissive way with an individual, can draw the narcissism out of them, right? Because the way that you want to interact with them is that you only reward them for disrespecting your boundaries, right? It's like, let's say a woman is with a man. He communicates his desires. When he communicates his desires, maybe things are good at first. He communicates his desires and she isn't receptive to it. Then let's say he starts to lose interest, genuinely lose interest, right? And then that insecurity of that interest being lost, it starts to be what invigorates that desire to engage sexually, right? And then from that place, it reinforces in a person's mind that the way to gain access to what they desire with you is through manipulation. And it's either that or women are just naturally attracted to highly narcissistic men, because I do believe that there is a correlation between women's sexual attraction and the dark triad traits, which are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, right? And those are for several different reasons. And we can definitely say that Lestat is somebody who possessed all three of those traits to some degree or another, right? But it's either a matter of you may be an individual who draws narcissism out of people who aren't clinically narcissists, or you are attracted to narcissistic individuals. And that's just a nature thing. There's a lot of this particular dynamic going on of cleaning up the image and the narratives that surround that surround Lestat. And I think that that's a very interesting concept of what they're doing, because now at this point in time, Vampire Chronicles has been finished, right? All of these things that were taking place for the most part, maybe not everything is taking place already, but the full series has been written. The showrunners have all of this source material to work off of to craft their own world, to craft their own understanding of what Vampire Chronicles looks like, with who the characters are, what they really represent. And they had to go back and clean up different aspects of Lestat, because he's truly the protagonist of the Vampire Chronicles series. And I think that through this maturity that Louis goes through, because Louis, he eventually reaches a place of masculine dominant. He learns the little drink. We see that in some episodes, right? He learns self-control. He learns mastery over his powers. He has loyal subjects and followers who are there to do his bidding, right? Because perhaps Louis was always meant to be more of a masculine dominant himself and not to truly be a feminine submissive. Maybe his masculinity was too strong within himself to truly give himself over to being a feminine submissive, right? Maybe that's just what it was all along. But in his interactions with Lestat, he was pretty much in love with that man. With his interactions with Lestat, Lestat did pretty much whatever he could, at times letting Louis win battles that he damn sure wasn't old enough, fed well enough, or skilled enough to win. He would let Louis have those interactions. Lestat would bend to different things that Louis wanted in order to maintain the interactions, because he just wanted Louis to be happy. But a lot of what Lestat wanted was for Louis to accept himself and who he was and what he desired. But Louis was not yet ready to accept himself on that level. So all it felt like to him was like an individual who was manipulating him, who was gaslighting him, who was narcissistic, who was controlling, who was crazy. That's all he saw. But as he grew to accept himself, there are, yes, some quirks that he wanted to keep behind. But ultimately, the things that Lestat wanted him to accept about himself, he ended up accepting. And once those things were accepted, he was able to heal and look back at his experiences with Lestat and realize that Lestat really wasn't the monster that he thought him out to be. Lestat was the vampire who was never given a choice. He was never given a choice. When he was turned, he was taken. So when he met Louis, he gave Louis a choice. And you have to think to yourself, right? There's a lot of scenarios that go like this. And we also have to keep in mind as well that sometimes there are scenarios that pop up in life and people's interactions may not be things that I'll do, but I see how these things go down at times. It's like, it's very common for an individual who is somewhat sexually repressed to regularly consume drugs and alcohol to lower their inhibitions enough for them to feel comfortable to engage in sexual activity that they would otherwise feel very negative towards or be too rigid for, right? There's a lot of women who will do that on purpose. And some of it is for the sake of plausible deniability, which is a double-edged sword. That's why I tell men, don't sleep with a woman who's under the influence of alcohol the first time you have sex with her. You need to have an understanding. Don't sleep with a woman who's trying to come over and be smoke buddies unless you already have an understanding that that's what she's coming over there for, and you have text message receipts or messenger receipts or whatever it is that show that this is the reason why she's coming over. Because even if she agrees under the influence, you can't technically consent if you're under the influence. And there may be a woman who desires that in that moment. She may, in that moment, like that. But that same plausible deniability that she used to give herself the opportunity to lower her inhibitions, when those inhibitions come back up, she may vilify you for taking advantage of her being in an altered state of mind. Understand that. There's a lot of things that go on with this cancel culture, with this Me Too movement, where some of these scenarios are people who definitely deserve what they got coming to them, but not all of them. Some situations are genuine misunderstandings. Some situations are ones in which an individual never expresses a lack of desire, but they're in their head. They lack boundaries. They lack the ability to assert themselves. Maybe they're projecting from their animus onto the man that if she tells him no, he may get aggressive and take it. And because she feels that way, she'll give it up. And the man may have no idea that in this woman's mind, she's thinking about what she's going to eat later and just hoping that it gets over with quickly so that she can get home safely. There's one reason why I definitely believe in being upfront about your sexual intentions when you meet a woman, if that's something that's on your itinerary of what you're trying to engage in. Because sometimes what pressure really represents is when a person is receiving something from you that they're enjoying, that they desire, that they crave, that they feel that they need. And then what it is that you desire them to reciprocate is something that they don't desire to give. And if they can tell or they can feel as if you are either pressing on what it is that you want in return prematurely, or that they feel like they may lose what it is that they're trying to get out of you if they don't bend to your whims and your sexual desires, then they will do something that includes a feeling of self-betrayal, and they will acquiesce to your sexual desires in order to maintain access to you non-sexually. And you may never know. You may never know. And this is something that I do look at to a certain extent as a no harm, no foul. Like, how can you know? You're not in that woman's head. You can't read her mind. But I do say to get very well acquainted with a woman having a high level of sexual attraction to you. Get very acquainted with understanding how to make consent something that can be even sexier. Like, have the woman ask you. Like, deal with her to the point and in a way where she's pretty much begging you for sex. That's something I do. You know, I'm a pleasure dom. And you got to understand the little drink, right? I had to learn the little drink, because what the little drink really represents is not taking a person to such depths and such heights emotionally and sexually in their experience of subspace that they become completely emotionally drained, pretty much stigmatized, and they lose their sense of self in that moment. And then they begin to make decisions and pour so much out of themselves that the moment that they come to their senses and their inhibitions come back up and they reach back into the state of mind that they had before they interacted with you, that they have to view you as a villain to justify the actions that they feel weren't logical coming from their part. They have to feel like you manipulated and took advantage of them, even if that's not the case. So sometimes you have to learn a little drink. That takes self-control. I call that not leading with the A-game dick. Real shit. And you got to have certain levels to your sex game to be able to even move like that in the first place. If you don't, then it don't really matter. Just do your best, nigga. Let's hope you get to hit it again. But this is for the men who are on a little bit of a higher level. Like if you saw my video on the Incubus game, you got to know how to take the little drink, right? The little drink. And make sure that the individual that you're dealing with, that there's a certain consistency to what's going on. You don't want somebody to just leave your house mad. You know, there's certain things that you want to make sure that you avoid. You know, even if dealing with the person under the influence is something that you would like to do, understand consensual non-consent, if that's something that you're into, and set up a dialogue. Have receipts of these dialogues. You know, make sure you vet the person's mental health to a certain extent. You're not going to know everything, right? And if you set your standards too high about all the things that you have to know and see before you have sex with a person, then the moment you get horny enough, you're not going to listen to that shit anyway. So just set a few rules for yourself to make sure that you're not going to cross. And one of those things is to not have sex with a woman unless she's enthusiastic about having sex with you, especially the first time, right? Unless she's sober and can consent. And this is to protect yourself and also to a certain extent to protect the woman. Show some discipline. Because as much as it's really natural for people to go out to a club and get drunk and hook up after they go to the club, or for two people to meet up under a context that is non-sexual when it becomes sexual, or very common for people to meet one another in the workplace, or very common for two individuals to link up and smoke together, and then they end up, you know, one thing leads to another and they have sex, that the same plausible deniability that you're using at times as a man may be just the fear of rejection, and that fear of rejection and waiting for that woman to be in a state of mind where her inhibitions are lowered at times can be pretty predatory. Now, she may be somebody who wants to be preyed on, but sometimes that's a weapon. Sometimes there are women out there, believe it or not, there are some women out there who will purposefully get drunk before they have sex with a man, so that if they don't get anything out of it, or if they feel slut-shamed, or if they feel judged, or if they don't like the guy later on, or if the experience doesn't go like they want, that they have a right to say that the man took advantage of them, even if it's something that they decided that they wanted to do in their own mind. And that's why you don't want to play the plausible deniability game. You don't want to play that game. Because some people cannot handle the weight of their own decisions. And I'm not even talking about an individual being taken advantage of. Some people cannot handle the weight of their own decisions. So they have to project and put the weight of their decisions on someone else. If someone has very negative emotions, like I said earlier in this video, if an individual has very negative emotions about a situation, they experience trauma, and they're having a hard time healing with it. If what they did, it conflicts with their view of how they see themselves to such, it's like such a night and day between how they would like to view themselves and the interactions that took place, then sometimes the only way that they can cope with such negative emotions, especially if they have low mental health, is to completely vilify the other person. To view the other person as someone who just took such great advantage of them, who just gaslighted the fuck out of them, who did all of this extra shit, because that's the only way they can cope with the decisions that they chose to make. And in this day and age, that mentality is something that will be rewarded and validated by the masses. Rewarded and validated. Even to the extent of smear campaigns that may be ran on you, a narcissistic smear campaign at that, right? And they may come track you down, track you down on Twitter or some shit like that, or on Facebook, or come and try to threaten your job, could mess with your money, could mess with your relationships, could negatively, emotionally, or mentally damage you from the stress of dealing with feeling as if you're being wrongly accused. You know, you have to understand that that's a very mentally and emotionally taxing thing for a man. But see, this is where personal accountability comes in at, right? Although it may not be as what the person said, may not be exactly what happened in certain situations. What you also have to understand is that personal accountability and how you moved is important. You know, if you ever find yourself in a situation like that, if you look back at your experiences with that woman, certain things that you saw, there may have been times where she gave off a little bit of Me Too vibes. You know what I mean? She may have given off certain vibes to show that she lacks the ability to take responsibility for her own choices. And oftentimes that may be conveyed through how negatively she speaks about her exes and her experiences. It may be conveyed through a woman who's always talking about stop sexualizing, normalize, ... all this other shit, but constantly using sex as something to garner attention and then not liking the attention that she gains from it, right? This is just some game. You have to recognize these things and understand that those type of women are out there, and that if you engage with that type of woman, she may deal with certain, she might put off a veneer of being sex positive because it's socially acceptable, but internally be very sex negative and be very sexually repressed. And that type of woman at times is a ticking time bomb. Eventually somebody's gonna get it. And the more games you play to deal with that type of woman, it's not to say that you can't hit it. It's not to say that you can't deal with her. It's not to say that you have to lie to her or force her to get it. But certain games that you might have to play to get it may just be a sign that you're touching on those lower aspects of her self-esteem. And if she goes to this very deep, far place with you, right? That if she doesn't like herself in that place, if she comes out of that mindset and she's like, oh, I know my worth. You have to understand that for a lot of these women out here, that know your worth thing is really a matter of it being based not on inherent values, not on value as a human being, because know your worth is oftentimes really about sexual access. Not all the time, but oftentimes know your worth is a phrase that women use that's often related to wanting to separate themselves from comparative value about what it is they actually bring to the table, or being non-sexually appealing, or being attractive, being in shape, being beautiful, having some level of youth, having some level of having a pleasant disposition and want to be around, right? And feeling as if all the men who she had casual sex with were men who didn't know her worth, when really she was just never non-sexually appealing enough for any of those men to want to take her seriously, right? And what you have to understand is, although she made a conscious choice and consented to sleeping with those men, the only way to rationalize that decision that she made to do something that goes against the way that she wants to view herself now, as she's built up a certain level of strength, or built up these principles or these ideologies, is to vilify those past experiences. That's a sign of a lack of accountability. And I'm not saying that there aren't negative things that happen to women. There are women who get approached by men on the street and they reject the man, and then the man might want to fight them, or might want to harm them, or do some crazy shit. And that's a bitch ass nigga. I don't want to, typically I just let it rip. I didn't want to use too much profanity in this video, but that's just the real thing. Those are just bitch ass niggas. And women do experience trauma at the hands of these particular types of men. But you have to understand that that negative feeling that they get from that type of man, they will project that onto a man who's not even doing that. Feel that same level of fear. That same level of fear, to a smaller extent, can be extended to a situation where she thinks she may like a man, right? Or she may want a man to like her. And in order to gain and or maintain access to that man non-sexually, when she could tell that sex is something that he wants, she may just give it up and then feel used, feel taken advantage of, feel dirty afterwards. And regardless of what that man thinks is in his own mind, you have now become a predator. You have now become just like the other men who used, abused, gaslit, coerced, raped, and took advantage of her. So I do think that this Odyssey of Recollection really brings into mind the idea of how the way we feel about people changes what things we accentuate within our internal narratives of our experiences with people, and how that can alleviate us from a certain sense of accountability, but how the mindset and the lens through which we look at our past experiences can affect how we feel about others as well as ourselves. And that this Odyssey of Recollection concept and how they're dealing with Lestat, to me, it exposes different aspects of cancel culture and the Me Too movement. It's Coach Brody. I'm out.